Good evening, children. Thank you for sending me all your lovely pictures and photographs. It really cheers me up. It's really kind of you. Now, on with our story. Mrs. Frisby and the Rats from Nim. We're on page 145 now in the Penguin edition. And do you remember yesterday we were reading that the rats, led by Nicodemus and Justin, had found Boniface Hall. And now there's going to be a little change of scenery now, so you don't get confused, because the next chapter is called The Main Hall, which is not Boniface Hall. This is in the rats' lair underground. So let's find out what happens. Remember, Nicodemus is narrating the story about how they escaped from Nim, and Mrs. Frisby is listening. But now something happens, so listen. The main hall. There came a knock at Nicodemus's office door. It opened, and Justin and Mr. Aegis entered. "Back so soon?" said Nicodemus. "Soon?" said Justin. "It's past noon. It's lunchtime." "Past noon?" Mrs. Frisby stood up, remembering her children waiting at home. Down in the rats' home, in the artificial light, it was hard to tell the passage of time, and she had been so engrossed in Nicodemus's story that she had not glanced at the clock. Justin was wearing a satchel like Nicodemus's, and from it he took a small paper package. "Here's Dragon's medicine," he said, putting it on the table. He asked Mrs. Frisby, "Did he tell you about the toy tinker?" Nicodemus said, "No, I was just coming to that." "But I can't stay to hear it now," said Mrs. Frisby. "My children will be waiting for their lunch." A plan was worked out. Mrs. Frisby would go home to take care of her children, and Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur and the other rats involved would work out the details of moving the house, which would be done that night at about 11 o'clock, after the Fitzgibbons are asleep, and we're sure Dragon is too, said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby would return in mid-afternoon to the rosebush. Mr. Aegis said, "And I'm going to lie down after making that trip with the cast. I'm tired." "You can have your choice of rooms," said Nicodemus. "Now that Jenna and his friends are gone, we have 7 empty." "Thank you," said Mr. Aegis. "Mrs. Frisby, when you return, I will tell you, as well as I can, exactly how to put the powder in Dragon's food," said Mr. Aegis. As she hurried home, Mrs. Frisby considered how much she should tell her children about all that had happened and all that was going to happen. She decided at that stage, at least, she would not tell them about their father's connection with the rats. Also, that she would not say she had volunteered to put the sleeping powder into Dragon's bowl. That would worry them. She could tell them perhaps when it was safely done, when, among other things, there would be no chance for Martin to volunteer in her place. She would tell them simply that, as the owl had suggested, she had gone to the rats and asked for help. She had found them friendly and intelligent, and a group of them were coming that night to move the house to a place where it would be safe from the plough. That would be enough. She could tell them the whole story later, when she knew it all herself. But it was not enough. The children were sceptical at first, then intensely curious, especially Timothy, who was looking stronger and feeling more energetic, but still staying in bed, primarily because Teresa and Martin had made him. "But why should the rats do that?" said Timothy. "We don't know them at all. Nobody does. They keep themselves to themselves." "Maybe it's because the owl sent me," said Mrs. Frisby, searching for an answer that would satisfy him. "They seem to be impressed by the owl." "For that matter," said Timothy, "I don't even see why the owl wanted to help. He's no friend of ours either." "Maybe they thought someday we could do them a favour in return." "Oh, Mother," said Cynthia, "how could we ever do them a favour?" "You forget, I did do Jeremy a favour," That's what started the whole thing. "That and my getting sick," said Timothy. "I wish I could get up. I'm tired of bed." "Not yet," said Mrs. Frisby, glad to change the subject. "You must save your strength, because tonight you will have to get up for a little while when they move the house. We must be sure you're well wrapped up and hope that the night is warm." "It will be," said Martin. "It's turned quite hot outside." They ate their lunch. That afternoon, Mrs. Frisby told the children that she must leave them to confer again with the rats about moving the house. When she thought of the danger she would face in just a few more hours, she wanted to kiss them all goodbye. But knowing that Timothy at least was already suspicious, she did not dare, but told them only that they should not worry if she was a little late getting home for supper. On her way back to the rose bush, she felt quite relieved, almost cheerful. Her problem was nearly solved, and the final solution was in sight. If all went well, Timothy would be saved. If all went well. Then the thought of what she had to do came back to her like the clanging of an alarm bell. What worried her most was not so much putting the powder into Dragon's bowl, but the fear that at the last minute she might lose her nerve and bungle it somehow. That could wreck the plan. She looked towards the Fitzgibbons farmhouse, and there on the back porch, lying in the sun, was Dragon. He was watching a pair of sparrows playing in the grass halfway to the chicken yard. The tip of his tail hardly twitched as he debated whether or not they were near enough to spring for. He looked very, very big and very dangerous. At least he was not looking in her direction, and Mrs. Frisby hurried on to the bush, directly to the hidden entrance, and slipped inside. When she reached the arched portal, Brutus was standing guard as before, but this time he greeted her politely. "I've been expecting you," he said. "May I go in?" If you'll just wait a minute, I'll get Justin." He went inside the arch and pressed a small button on the wall. Mrs. Frisby had not noticed it before. "A doorbell," she said. "Yeah, it rings a buzzer down below. If I pushed it 3 times, you'd see some action." "Action?" "Yeah, that's the alarm signal. A dozen rats would come out of this door, ready to fight. All the rest, with the women and the children, would be hurrying out of the back door." "Oh, I didn't know there was a back door." "It comes out into the woods in the blackberry bramble. It's got a longer tunnel than this one." When Justin appeared, they went down the same hallway as before, but this time, when they reached the chamber where the lift and the stairway led down, Justin paused. "Nicodemus thought you might like to see our main hall. Just a quick look. He said you asked about the plan." "I did," said Mrs. Frisby, but he didn't tell me about it." It's more than just a plan now, but we're used to calling it that. If you see the main hall, you'll get an idea of what we're doing." So, instead of going down as they had before, Justin led the way across the chamber where Mrs. Frisby had noticed the tunnel continued. They walked along for what seemed like several more minutes. "Somewhere right along here," Justin remarked, "we're entering the woods. You'll notice the tunnel runs a bit crooked. We had to bend it to go around all the taproots, some as thick as fence posts." They went on until they came to a fork in the tunnel. "Right fork leads out into the blackberry bramble," said Justin. "Left fork leads to the main hall." They took the left fork. "Now brace yourself for a surprise." From ahead came noises, the sound of many rats talking, a sound of hurrying and thumping and of machinery running. They stepped into a room as full of activity as a factory. It was the biggest room Mrs. Frisby had ever seen, half the size of a house, with a ceiling and floor of hard grey rock. It was brightly lit with electric bulbs. Here, the large-sized ones, strung, unshaded, and beneath them were rats at work everywhere. Rats running electric motors that ran belts that ran small circular saws, lathes, drills, grindstones, and other tools Mrs. Frisby could not name. Rats hammering, welding, cutting, but most of all, rats hauling. There was a steady procession to and from the far end of the chamber, and each of these rats wore a harness to which was fastened a pair of large, sturdy sacks, one on each side like a miniature pack-horse. As the rats trooped in, their sacks were empty. They disappeared into a part of the room that was hidden by a high wall of wood, and then they came out, the sacks were full, and they were also very heavy. As she watched, a troop of 10, their sacks bulging, went past her out of the tunnel. They greeted Justin and nodded at her, but they did not pause. She noticed that just inside the entrance an electric fan whirred quietly, aiming inward, pulling fresh air into the room from somewhere out in the woods. Mrs. Frisby stood beside Justin and gasped. She felt dizzy at the sight, the motion, the noise, and the size of the room, which must have measured 20 feet long and almost as wide. "How could you ever dig out such a big room?" she asked. "We didn't," said Justin. "We found it. It's a natural cave. You can see that the ceiling and floor are solid rock. That's the reason, or the main one, we chose this spot to live. Others have lived here before us, probably, for centuries before there was a farmhouse. Bears, then wolves, then foxes, and then groundhogs. We had quite a cleaning job to do, I can tell you. When we found it, there was a large hole, only a few feet long, leading straight in, but it was so full of sticks and leaves you could hardly see it. We closed that entrance entirely and dug another, longer and narrower, our back door. And then we dug our living quarters under the rose bush and the entrance you came in. But the cave is still our chief workshop. Let's go in." As they entered, some of the rats looked up. Some waved and smiled, but all quickly turned back to the work they were doing, as if they were in a hurry. "They're all on a schedule," Justin explained, talking close to Mrs. Frisby's ear to be heard above the noise, "so they can't stop working." One group, especially busy, was gathered around an odd-shaped object of wood and metal about a foot long. It was curved and had a point at one end. It looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, rather like the side of a small boat. Could the rats be making a boat? And then she saw that they were fastening a strong metal ring to the top of it. Justin led her to it. "That," he said, "is our most important invention, the key to the whole plan. We made a pilot model last autumn. We tried it out and it worked, so now we're making 3 more. But what is it?" "It's a plough. Nicodemus designed it himself, after reading every book he could find about farm tools. It's light and sharp, especially made to be pulled by rats. It takes 8 of us to pull it, more if the turf is tough. But with it, we can turn over in a day of hard work a patch of earth about 10 by 15 feet. "But why? Why do you need it for?" asked Mrs. Frisby. "Come over here and I'll show you." He led the way to the back of the cave where the high walls stood. He opened a door and beckoned her through. She stood in a large wooden bin. Starting at her feet and rising in a slope to the wall of the cave was a small mountain of grain. "Oats," said Justin. He led her on, opened another door on another mountain. "Wheat," he said, "and others. Barley, corn, soy, beans. We've been building these stockpiles for a long time," he said, "all from Mr. Fitzgibbon's barn. We now have a 2-year supply for 108 rats, plus enough to plant for 2 crops, in case the first one fails. In there," he gestured towards the last bin in the row, "we have boxes of seeds. Seeds for tomatoes, beets, carrots, melons, and a lot more." All the time they stood there, the steady procession of rats continued. They entered the bins, took off their harness sacks, filled the sacks with grain, put them on again, and left through the tunnel, out of the back door. They looked, Mrs. Frisby thought, like very large ants, endlessly toiling on an anthill. Justin must have got the same impression, for he said, "Well, if the ants can do it, Nicodemus says, if the bees can do it, so can we." "Do what?" said Mrs. Frisby. "Why, Live without stealing, Mrs. Frisby. That's the whole idea. That's the plan. Okay, so now we are on to a new chapter called The Toy Tinker. You might want to pause that so you can see it. Now, if you don't have time to listen to another chapter tonight, you could perhaps listen to this chapter in the morning. But if you do have time, here we go. The Toy Tinker. This is a continuation of Nicodemus explaining the story to Mrs. Frisby of the rat's escape. So remember, they were in the Boniface. Here we are. We left the Boniface estate on the 1st of May, said Nicodemus. We knew a lot more than when we went in. We had been there for 8 months. Then, said Justin, we found the toy tinker. They were back in Nicodemus's office. Mr. Ages, having rested, sat with them. Not quite yet, said Mr. Ages. No, said Nicodemus, that was in late summer. When we first got out, we began searching for a place to live permanently, or at least a place where we could stay as long as we wanted. We had a pretty clear idea of what we were looking for. We had had plenty of time to talk about it on the long winter evenings in the library between reading books. The reading we did. We knew very little about the world, you see, and we were really curious. We learned about astronomy, about electricity, biology and mathematics, about music and art. I even read quite a few books on poetry and got to like it pretty well. But what I liked best was history. I read about the ancient Egyptians, the Greeks and the Romans, and the Dark Ages when the old civilizations fell apart and the only people who could read and write were the monks. They lived apart in monasteries. They led the simplest kind of lives and studied and wrote, and they grew their own food, built their own houses and furniture. They even made their own tools and their own paper. Reading about that, I began getting some ideas of how we might live. Most of the books were about people. We tried to find some about rats, but there wasn't much. We did find a few things. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias that had sections on rats. From them we learned that we were about the most hated animals on earth, except for maybe snakes and germs. That seemed strange to us and unfair, especially when we learned that some of our close cousins, squirrels for instance, and rabbits, were well liked. But people think we spread diseases, and I suppose possibly we do, though never intentionally. And surely we never spread as many diseases as people themselves do. Still, it seemed to us that the main reason we were hated must be that we always lived by stealing. From the earliest times, rats lived around the edges of human cities and farms, stowed away on men's ships, gnawed holes in their floors, and stole their food. Sometimes we were accused of biting human children. I didn't believe that, nor did any of us, unless it was some kind of a normal rat bred in the worst of city slums. And that, of course, can happen to people too. Had we then no use at all in the world? One encyclopedia had a sentence of praise for us. The common rat is highly valued as an experimental animal in a medical research centre due to his toughness, intelligence, versatility and biological similarity to man. We knew quite a lot about that already. But there was one book written by a famous scientist that had a chapter about rats. Millions of years ago, he said, rats seemed to be ahead of all the other animals, seemed to be making a civilization of their own. They were well organised and built quite complicated villages in the fields. Their descendants today are the rats known as prairie dogs. But somehow it didn't work out. The scientist thought that maybe it was because the rats' lives were too easy, while the other animals, especially the monkeys, were living in the woods and getting tougher and smarter. The prairie dogs grew soft and lazy and made no more progress. Eventually the monkeys came out of the woods, walking on their hind legs, and took over the prairies and almost everything else. It was then that The rats were driven to become scavengers and thieves, living on the fringes of a world run by men. Still, it was interesting to us that for a while at least the rats had been ahead. We wondered if they had stayed ahead, if they had gone on and developed a real civilization, what would it have been like? Would rats too have shed their tails and learned to walk erect? Would they have made tools? Probably, though we thought not so soon and not so many. A rat has a natural set of tools that monkeys lack, sharp pointed teeth that never stop growing. Consider what the beavers can build with no tools but their rodent teeth. Surely rats would have developed reading and writing, judging by the way we took to it. But what about machines? What about cars and aeroplanes? Maybe not aeroplanes. After all, monkeys living in trees must have felt a need to fly, must have envied the birds around them. Rats may not have had that instinct. In the same way, a rat civilization would probably never have built skyscrapers, since rats prefer to live underground. But think of the endless subways below subways below subways they would have had. We thought and talked quite a bit about all this, and we realised that a rat civilization, if ever one did grow up, would not necessarily turn out to be anything at all like human civilization. But the fact was, after 8 months in the Boniface estate, none of us was sorry to move out of it. It had given us shelter, free food and an education, but we were never really comfortable there. Everything in it was designed for animals who looked, moved and thought differently from the way we did. Also, it was above ground, and that never felt quite natural to us. So when we left, we decided that our new home should be underground, preferably, if we could find it, in a cave. But where? We thought hard and studied maps and atlases. There were plenty of those in the study. And finally we reached some conclusion. To find a cave, we would have to go where there were mountains. There aren't many caves in flatlands. And for food, it would have to be near a town, or even better, a farm. So we wanted to find a farm, preferably a big one, with a big barn and silos full of grain near the mountains. We studied the maps some more, and it was Jenna, I think, who spotted this area as a good place to look. On the map, a big part of it was covered with the contour lines that show mountains, and across these were written the words Thorn Mountains National Forest. Beneath that, in smaller letters, it said Protected Wilderness Preserve. Bordering this, where the mountains turned to foothills, the map showed rolling country with quite a few roads but hardly any towns, which we thought ought to mean farmland. We were right, as of course you know now. It took us 2 months of steady travelling to get to the Thorn Mountains National Forest, but we found it. We're under the edge of it right now. And there are plenty of caves, most of them never visited by people because people aren't allowed to drive into a wilderness preserve. There aren't any roads in the forest, but only a few jeep trails used by rangers, and aeroplanes are not permitted to fly over it. We looked at a lot of caves, some big, some small, some dry, but mostly damp. Before we chose this cave and this farm, however, we found the Toy Tinker. It began as a sad sort of thing. We found an old man lying in the woods one morning near one of the jeep trails not so far from here, and he was dead. We don't know what he died of. We guessed it must have been a heart attack. He was dressed in a black suit, old-fashioned in style but neat, not ragged. His hair was white and his face looked gentle. I wonder who he was and where he was going, Justin said. Whoever he was, Jenna said, he wasn't supposed to be in here at all. We ought to bury him, I said. So we did. Not by digging a grave, but by covering him with a high mound of leaves and stones and twigs and earth. It was in a gathering material for this mound that Justin made the second discovery. He was back in the bushes, out of our sight. "Look here," he called. "I found a truck." It was a very ancient truck with a small round hood, but it had been lovingly polished and was wonderfully shiny. The body, which was square and large, had been rebuilt and painted red and gold. It had little windows and white curtains, and between them, lettered in gold, were signs. They read, "The Toy Tinker. Toys, repairs, hobby kits, model sets, electrical toys, all work guaranteed." Obviously, the truck had belonged to the old man. He was a peddler and a mender of toys. The red and gold wagon was his shop and his home, and he had driven into the woods to camp for the night. It was against the law, of course, so he had concealed the truck behind some bushes, off the trail under a big beech tree. We could see where he had made a campfire, carefully surrounding it with stones and clearing away the brush so he would not set the woods afire. Beyond the beech tree, a narrow brook flowed. It was a peaceful spot. We could see what had probably caused the old man's death. One wheel of the truck had sunk into the soft earth and was stuck. A shovel lay near it. He had been trying to dig the wheel out of the mud. The work had been too hard for him, and he had started to go for help when he must have collapsed. This much we could figure out just by looking. And then somebody said, "Whose truck is it now?" "It belongs to his heirs," I said. "Whoever they are," said Jenna. "He may not even have any. He seems to have been alone." "Anyway," said someone else, "how would they ever find it?" "That's true," I said. "We don't know who he was, and if we did, we had no way of notifying anyone. So I suppose, if we want it, the truck is ours." "Why don't we see what's in it?" said Jenna. That's the end of that chapter, and tomorrow I'll be starting on page 163 in a chapter called Thorn Valley. Okay, so I hope you're enjoying the story. We're about 3/4 of the way through this book, and after this book is finished, I shall be reading you lots of short stories which you can see on the shelf behind me, and I'll be able to hopefully read a short story every night. And I've got some lovely books from school, some short Shakespeare's, all sorts of lovely entertaining books, some Enid Blyton books too, lots of others. Anyway, I think it's time for bed, isn't it, soon? So I better let you get off and say goodnight. Keep saying your prayers, won't you? Especially for all those people out there helping keeping people healthy and getting them all better. The people that are working and supporting all the work that's going on in the country at the moment. Say your prayers for your parents and your family, and have lots of kind thoughts for your brothers and sisters, and lots of kind words. Okay? All right, God bless, and I'll see you again tomorrow.